I want to start by introducing you, but I think you'll do a better job than me. So I want you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, so my name is Wocjiech Mamak. I hail from Warsaw, Poland, where I work at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Sciences. I'm a philosopher by training, but I'm mostly interested in cognitive science and meta-scientific questions right now. I work at the Department for Logic and Cognitive Science. So I try to combine my philosophical background with problems in cognition, mostly. So this is my interest right now. I also have some secondary interests in history of science, which I try to cultivate from time to time. But mostly I do focus on philosophy right now.
Wonderful. And Wojciech and I met during his visit in Mongolia a year ago. And we actually did a podcast at the time, but because of the camera problem, we couldn't publish it until now. But we decided to remake it.
Yeah, I'm very glad we can do it remotely because that was unfortunate.
Yeah. So I've prepared some questions and I just want to ask them one by one. But if there is something I want to follow up, I'll ask.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So our main topic during your visit to Mongolia was about the role of philosophy in science. And also our organization invited you to our office and we presented you about what our program, which is about the social and emotional learning and specifically the secular ethics, or in other words, compassion-based ethic. So my first question is, do you think it's possible to have a secular ethic, or in other words, as we say, the compassion-based ethic, the ethic that is coming from our universal nature, if I may say, of loving and showing kindness and being compassionate to all the living beings? Or do you think it's just an idea that's nice to have, but very hard to make it possible in real life? I want to hear your opinion on this matter.
Yeah, so I think that there are two things that you can pry apart here. The first thing is whether or not ethics should have a religious component or it should be secular. And the second one is whether, if we answer positively to the question, whether the compassion-based ethics is the natural implication of this assertion. So to the first question, I think the answer, I have a pretty strong opinion on that. I would say that not only it is feasible, but only it is the only feasible option. Like, it seems to me that any sort of religious component is absolutely not welcome in any sort of ethical considerations. First and foremost, because it's not required, but also I think it limits our ability to reason very objectively and fairly to ourselves. Because I think any sort of fair and any sort of responsible interaction with the world has to take into account the possibility of undermining any assumption we might have. And if we are to start with some dogmas that we to preserve in the first place, I think it puts us in a very disingenuous position, and also like a fairly biased and fairly damaging role as not only as philosophers, but as people who try to reflect on things, basically. So that would be the first thing I would have to say about that. Also, I think that the appeal of religious-based ethics is chiefly stemming from the fact that they're masquerading as natural law type of theories. So, in other words, they are trying to convince you and the people who adhere to their principles that they are simply firstly stating and then following some kind of natural order of things, whether motivated by a supernatural being or some kind of like more general nature, which has certain properties that obviously this religion only gets the best and is only in charge of enforcing them. I think it's fairly common, and I think our role as philosophers is to try to undermine this notion as much as possible. And of course, these natural orders of things can have many forms, because obviously any sort of religion will have a different opinion on what sort of this natural order looks like. But I think in general, the role of a person who is serious about secular ethics and secular understanding of the word is to say that we have to see it for what it is, and what it is just sort of a very devious and sophisticated form of preserving the status quo. Because when you reflect very carefully about any sort of a philosophical system, you can see that it rests on certain assumptions, and these assumptions can be challenged and should be challenged, and they can be remade if you think that the entire system is faulty for some reason. And if you do not have this ability, and I think that in a seriously secular system, you do not have this option, you are unable to do so, and you are unable to see it for what it is. And I think that the role of philosophy here is to make it very obvious, to show where these assumptions are, how can you really challenge them, and how can you replace them. And so that would be my view on the secular question. As for the second one, I have maybe less to say. I think that definitely compassion-based ethics is an interesting alternative, and definitely has the core tenet is the one I'm sympathetic to, and I think everybody should be sympathetic to. But I think that the first question is probably the most important, because just wrap up, I think we were maybe a little bit convinced 10 or 15 years back that these kind of traditional systems of thinking and of justifying actions, which are the moral systems, where maybe backtracking a little bit, and there is no coming back to this traditional modes of enforcing norms and enforcing choices of your own and other people's actions. But then we can see that all these traditional systems, very conservative, are making a huge comeback. You can see that across the pond in the States, but also in Europe, that I think there's a big strive to come back to these things that we thought maybe were a little bit outdated, and they're not. So I think just to conclude, I think that this task is probably like even more serious and challenging than it was that we thought it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Right. I don't want to move on to a very big topic, but I want to stick to the simple things, but also keep in mind that we're talking about the secular ethic. I remember when I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and he was very, very hesitant about the topic, the secular ethic. And he argued that he asked me about my opinion on the matter of the children's or the newborn's foundation of being ethic. Like, isn't there someone who was born as a bad person, or as a person who is more tended to do the bad things when they grow up? And my answer to that question was, I just don't know, because I don't know the ways or the methods to study that thing. What do you think about the foundation of the human being? Are we born as in a way that is very similar to each other? Are we born as very different from each other, and we are destined to be like that from the beginning of our life? Or is it not a topic in philosophy?
No, definitely. I think what you're asking is the maybe in other terms the question of innateness, of how much is given to you as a package, and how much just is the effect of the upbringing and the social context and everything that happens after you're born, I suppose. And I think it really matches well with our previous topic. Maybe you can have an intuition right now that I will be very careful about any sort of strongly innate theories. I think that, again, these are the types of things that are trying to masquerade as a natural order in order to justify something that is very malleable and very up to our decisions in terms of, if you think of the society, of how we organize the upbringing of the children, what type of norms and what types of modes of thinking we try to teach them, but also in terms of our individual decisions as peers, as parents, as colleagues, as whoever. Just to clarify, I'm not saying that there is no innate component. Definitely there is. There is some very interesting research right now on animal cognition, for example, and the experimenters are devising very clever experiments and trying to pry apart the inherited from the let's say socially or culturally constructed. And it seems to me that there is obviously some individual differences on this individual level, but they are usually, in my mind, very much overblown. And perhaps the reason for that is that it's easy to justify, but also it's very easy to think, because you hear it all the time. You know, something is in your DNA or something like this is the thing we sometimes call essentialism in philosophy. That there is some sort of your essence that's just either the effect of a biological transmission, or maybe there's some more arcane theory behind it. But I think it's very lazy, and it also removes, it's not only false, but it also removes the sort of agency that we should try to reclaim, or maybe just claim as subjects, as agents in the world. And we obviously have to study it very carefully, how much is innate and how much is not. But it seems to me that the essentialist doctrine is very much overblown because of these two reasons.
Right. I think that begs the question of teaching secular ethics to the people and children. Like, is it possible for us, the adults, to teach that kind of topics? And actually, if we say that we can teach, that also, I think, begs the question of the measurement. Like, how can we measure the improvement of secular ethics in young kids? So do you think, first of all, is it possible to teach? And if so, whether or not measuring the construct is possible as well?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Two questions, in fact, as you mentioned. So maybe I will just tackle them separately, one after another. So as for the teaching part, I think that obviously one can argue that it's a hairy question, because it's very hard to imagine any sort of milestones to evaluate the effects of teaching. And it maybe points to certain traditional philosophical debates about whether you can teach the character, the virtue, and is there a doctrine called the ethical intellectualism that is a very traditional way of looking at philosophy and an upbringing as a sort of a path that has certain pragmatic criteria that you can make a person better equipped to make informed decisions. So in a sense that there is a positive correlation between education, roughly speaking, and their moral fortitude, or their ability as cognizers to do things ethically and to pursue their own happiness. So that would be like the traditional way of looking at it. Obviously, if you look at the empirical data, I think it's quite unclear whether there is this correlation between education and the subjective perception of happiness. But regardless, I think that, just to come back to your original question, is the role of the school, it seems to me, in this department is a little bit different than in other aspects of education. And I think here the objective of the tutors, of the psychologists, or people who work in pedagogy, is to provide certain set of tools and techniques for the children to first discern the patterns of certain behaviors, teaching them how to name them, and giving them as sort of a wide toolbox of how to assess them and how you can cope with them, without providing them with clear-cut solutions to them, because obviously these do not exist as a sort of a one tool fixes all kind of arrangement. There are obviously there's merit in learning how to name your feelings, name your relations, name your statements and judgments about the world, and trying to see what kind of options are on the table from philosophy, from psychology, from certain other pedagogical theories about how to interact with yourself, with the others, and with the world. And I think this is the role that the school should have in this department, in sort of like broadening the horizons and providing the tools and a certain set of answers without enforcing them, in a sense, or without providing any sort of algorithm or any sort of benchmarks or checklists or whatever. I think there is possibility to combine some sort of progress in terms of the abilities and also like sort of like air quotes performance of children without having any sort of normative curriculum or whatever about it. So that would be my very maybe naive answer, because I'm not a teacher and not a. I think that's maybe just like a corollary note here. I think the philosophers should be pretty honest here about it, that we are not experts about good life as, air physics engineers are about how to construct a plane. It's a little bit more subtle and different here. And I think I'm always very suspicious about people who are telling you how to live because they've read a bunch of philosophical books. They can give you tools and answers to choose from, and they can point at certain things, and they can teach you how to think better and point out these assumptions. But I think any sort of lecturing here is very suspicious, and I think it's very disingenuous here. So I would not try to claim this position. But having said that, I think there is important work to do here to answer your question. So that's the first one. That might be a little bit longer answer because it's actually two questions. I think that obviously the second problem of measurement and trying to set up certain operationalizations is very pertinent to the first question, and I think it's maybe even more interesting. My answer to this is that I'm generally a bit guarded about the abilities to quantify this kind of metric, to set up these metrics to quantify these kind of properties. And by these kind of properties, I mean things like happiness, obviously, and certain woolly concepts that have this normative component, things like the quality of life, things like the satisfaction, and this kind of things that obviously are the most important for trying to understand what we're doing in terms of social and emotional learning. But at the same time, I think they are very different from other psychometrical factors that we routinely measure in psychology or in cognitive science. Obviously, it doesn't mean that there hasn't been the attempt to do so. You're probably very aware of that. The things like the quality of life measurements. There are certain variations to that. There is Mensa, there is the LQI, and the other ones. But basically, you're trying to put a number and quantify the quality of life or the level of happiness. And I think it's a very doomed project, but only for certain purposes. Because if you try to use it for certain systemic reasons, for example, to see whether a policy is doing its job, you need a certain set of metrics to see if the actions that you're trying to advise or enforce is actually working, to see if this metric is increasing or whatever. And that seems fine to me. For example, if you look at medicine, they have to quantify certain aspects of the efficacy of certain treatments. And for that, you need, I think, metrics that are, I think, in mass, pretty useful, but they are pretty useless in terms of adjudicating the singular person's experience. Because at the end of the day, it's very hard to pin this decision on somebody else, on any sort of allocentric, so like not your own, but the criteria that are just enforced from the outside on you. And it's obviously a very trivial kind of argument, but I think it really defeats this like very strong program of trying to devise this extremely precise measurement program for any kind of happiness factors. Of course, there's been research on that in psychology. There is this foresight questionnaire measurement. There's been this recent recent attempts to measure happiness, that they're trying to make it more sophisticated. There's this 3 factors, for example, and you try to adjudicate the, I think it's, there is the evaluative component, the affective component, and the eudaimonic component, right? But even if you make it more complex, at the end of the day, you are trying to devise a score that should, in a sense, override another person's opinion on their own happiness, which is very bizarre. Obviously, it's a tricky subject. So it's very hard to find any kind of objective measure here. So I think that any sort of these measurement procedures as EQ, for example, that you were pointing out,
Right.
might have its merits if you are using them very carefully and you're very transparent about the assumptions you're using, but also about the end goals that are using them for. Why do you need them in the first place? The reason for that, I think, or one of the reasons, but to me a very important reason, is that if you look at any sort of measurement or practices, and whenever there's some metrics try to be set up with, which was not there in the first place, and when I was actually studying these things quite extensively from the historical perspective, is that there is a very very quickly the strive to game the system in a sense. So if you set up the system to achieve a certain score, for example, there's very quickly this ambition, this desire to actually get a hang of the system and how to, in a sense, game it. How do you can influence the components of the score and try to maximize it, very often leading to the distortion to the original ambitions of the system, because you're not actually doing something, let's say, naturally with which the whole measurement system is trying to really measure, but you're trying to basically cook the numbers by doing things intentionally. So it's a little bit like, you're probably familiar with the Goodhart's law, right? So when the catchphrase for that is that when the measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure anymore. And that's basically it. That any sort of a numerical system, quantifiable system that looks like that, I think it's very prone to this kind of distortions, and I think we can agree on the fact that these are distortions. You look at people who are trying to do this data-driven life trend or any sort of like optimization, and you see it all the time, right now in the all sort of this like protocols, how to optimize any aspect of your life, make it more efficient. You set up the benchmarks, you look at the scores, there are apps for that all the time. It's I don't know, perhaps has its limited merits, but if you look at it at any sort of like objective measurement, it gets distorted very, very quickly. You can, if you haven't, take a look at the documentary about Brian Johnson, right? The guy who is the I don't know, the poster boy for the optimization process, this millionaire who's trying to transform his life into this whole series of optimization procedures. And I think you can see.
Yeah, the guy who's trying to stay alive for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's that. And maybe the last thing that I want to say here, that the corollary of this metric establishing procedure and slapping a number or everything and trying to optimize it and whatever, I think the other possibly concerning or even mischievous thing is that when you have these kinds of measurements and you have these systems, I think it's very, very tempting for people to use them as a sort of yardstick, not only for themselves, but to compare with each other. So there is this this competitive component in trying to, first, you're making a race of something which is not a race, which I think it's quite a annoying thing. And quite a dangerous thing, maybe. But also, I think it gives people, or gives us, this kind of, let's say, impulse to compare to each other in a sense of trying to establish a sort of hierarchy. So, you're trying to take it as a sort of an objective measure of who is better than another person in certain aspect, which obviously might be fine in some respects. I'm very up for any sort of sporting competitions. I watch obscene amount of them, but sports is sports, and when you try to make a race of much more, and then pretend the people who are not adhering to that are just like sleepwalking through the race that they don't know they're partaking in, because there is this measure that you can point at as a sort of this rules of the game kind of thing. It seems to be very, very dangerous and bizarre. So I think that there are certain big drawbacks or potential obstacles if you try to use this operational procedures, measurements, metrics, ratios, indexes, whatever, however you want to name it, models, in a very fast and loose manner. So just to wrap up, I think the happiness aspect, the social aspect of personal satisfaction is one of the worst candidates for me to try to quantify. If you want to make a very strong program out of the quantification and not a limited one, as I try to maybe envision in the beginning.
Okay, I think that was a very good answer. I think I should ask my last question. Since we started talking about the ethics, secular ethics, and also a little bit about social emotional learning, and we briefly mentioned about the happiness, I want to ask more about the happiness part. As a cognitive scientist or a cognitive philosopher, do you think the happiness or the feeling of happiness is coming from our cognition, or do you think it's coming from what we say psyche? Because in Mongolia we have a translation to that word, the psyche. We call it sitkit, and we tend to see the psyche as different from our cognition or the cognitive abilities. For example, when we say we are very hurt, we say my sitkit is hurt, like my psyche is hurting, but we don't take it as a part of or the work our cognition is doing, or the brain is doing its job. So what do you think about that? Like when we say happiness, do you think is it a result of our cognition, or in other words, our biases or the circumstances that is influencing how our brain reacting, or do you think it's a thing that can't be like constructed or, as you said, operationalized?
Yeah. Well, so I think I have to start with giving the most annoying answer the philosophers always give is it depends how you define cognition and what you mean by that. But I don't want to say that it's a verbal problem, because it's not. I just want to maybe clarify a little bit. And maybe I'll present my own perspective. I tend to have a quite broad definition of cognition, maybe because then I can be interested in more stuff as a person interested in cognition. But for instance, it seems to me that any sort of, as we always might say, affective processing, so naming and expressing and identifying feelings is definitely a cognitive endeavor for me. Also, I think ethical, let's say processing, ethical thinking, or ethical part of our brain is definitely, if not wholly cognitive, it's definitely has a significant cognitive component to it. So I would say it is also a part of the cognitive apparatus. So that would be my answer for the time being. Also, I want to make maybe a second proviso here that if what you have in mind is that there's a differentiation between an intellect and a soul, for example, or any sort of this irrational part of the human being that complements to the brain, that obviously is an important idea in philosophy that I reject. I think that if that's what you have in mind, that there's a certain, I don't know, substance within a human being that is responsible for intuition, for example, or any sort of external or parallel processing to what happens inside cognition per se, I think that's unscientific, and I would reject that. I understand that it's sometimes useful to think of it like that in terms of like our everyday folk psychology, saying like, oh, there is this intuition, or there is this, he has this, this feeling or this knack or whatever, and that's perfectly fine. But I think that's just a handy way of describing something that has a very cognitive kind of basis that we either do not understand yet, or we just are not qualified to say how it works, or maybe we just try to generalize over the details. So having said that, because I think that there is a very broad definition of cognition, so that was my first point, and the second point was that we have to adhere to strictly what we call naturalistic stance. So we only subscribe and refer to things that are empirically and scientifically describable, and we can, account for the mechanisms and explanations for that. And that's the only realm of philosophical inquiry and explanation that we can give. I think if you combine these two, you are inclined to say that obviously also the perception of happiness, of well-being, of norms, of virtues, and everything that's maybe you think that's extending the realm of the scientific inquiry. And I agree about that, has this very strong component of just cognitive processing that influences these decisions. If you think that studying that can help you make better informed decisions, I think that's a very reasonable answer. But at the same time, I think you cannot say that it could justify your action totally, or it can give you a clear-cut answers. Maybe, circling back to what you mentioned at the beginning, that, when we were talking in person, maybe the general motive, what we were trying to discuss in many aspects, was the role of philosophy in science, or philosophy in cognitive science. And I think here it may be visible again that, as I see the role of a philosopher for this problem and in general, is that we have to be, in a sense, embedded in science, embedded in empirical practice, and in what we know about the world, and also what we know about the human brain and the human cognition. Because, just to clarify, I'm not saying that anything happens only inside the brain, because it's way too limited. We can talk about it a little bit later, maybe. But in general, that there is this cognitive system that we call, the brain, just to be shorter and clearer. But the role of philosopher is not the role of the scientist, in terms of, because the scientist is mostly in the business of problem solving, right? And I think philosophers are not in the business of problem solving, and if they are, they're not in the same type of problem solving business. So we are, I think, our problem solving is about pointing out deficiencies, pointing out inconsistencies, offering the ways to make them more concrete, to make them more rigid, to make them more sensible, in a sense. And that applies to any sort of research on happiness, on social and emotional learning, and everything. That I think we can poke holes, we can try to make the concepts clearer, we can try to offer a certain sort of techniques and solutions, without pointing for clear-cut algorithms or solutions. A little bit like what we said about the school. I think it's a similar kind of idea, that it has to be very scientifically informed, but it is not a mere problem solving.
Right. That's nice. I asked the last question. I wanted to clarify why I asked the last question, because I met some people who say that the happiness is an absurd thing that's pointless or meaningless. There's no such thing like happiness. But at the same time, when I ask why do they wake up every morning from their sleep, and why do they go to work and live as the other human beings, their answer also comes to being happy, in a sense. So that made me confused. Like, when they say the happiness is nothing, but also they're also trying to achieve that by living a life as a human being. So there's always this confusion in my mind, that why are we living? And also, if the answer to that question is happiness, what is the happiness actually? Like, is it the construct of our mind, or is it something that we don't know at all, or is it something that can't be measured and we can't tell whether we're being happy or not, etc. And also, I wanted to make this confusion be a part of many other people, in this case our listeners. Like, it's quite difficult to come into a conclusion, like definite conclusion, in terms of our cognition and the constructs that we are trying to study in the science of psychology. So yeah, I think your answer helped me to make the point, I think. Okay, so is there anything you want to say more?
I don't know if you want me to speculate on that, but yeah, basically, I think a few things that we mentioned if you combine them together, would point at this kind of answer that you gave, that we cannot give definite answers, but it doesn't mean that there are not better or worse theories.
Right.
Philosophical inquiries about trying to see which doctrine or theory works better or not. So if you present a person with certain opinions about happiness, you should point at the pros and cons that they have.
Oh, yes.
If you look at the utilitarian doctrine, or you look at the virtue ethics, or you look at any sort of different deontology, for example, what are these tenets? What are the consequences? You can present the examples, but you cannot really say which one is the right one, right?
Right.
But it doesn't mean that it's a pointless endeavor. On the contrary, it gives you a way better position to actually understand the consequences of your action, but also to justify it, to have a better grasp of the mechanisms that underlie it. What we said at the beginning about, to maybe just give an example, what we said about the natural law theories or any kind of essentialism, which usually is expressed in religious terms. I think that's the perfect example that, if you provide people with careful analysis of these kind of moral systems, they can see them for what they are. They can see that the assumptions are not set in stone. The role of us here is to show the status quo for just a certain set of choices, historically or socially constructed, that are, there is this famous Ursula Le Guin quote, that it's not about ethics, but it's about capitalism, that, capitalism is a system that its power seems unavoidable, like the divine power of gods in feudal systems. And it can be changed and challenged. And the same follows for any sort of natural order theories that just claim that, that's how it has to be, because it just follows logically from nature. And that's basically what current capitalist ideology is giving you as a justification for that. What I'm trying to say here, that you can obviously accept it, that's fine, without just giving bullshit justifications for that. And the role of a philosopher here is just to showing what it's and showing what it's really like. And if you are happy with accepting that with all the consequences, that's fine. But I think the merit here is just understanding what you're really getting. Where does it come from? What are the consequences? And then you can make an informed choice. And then there is a normative component here, but at the end of the day, you're not giving any sort of problem solving kind of answer. And I think that's, again, it's maybe to a personal flavor and liking to a person. I think that's a satisfying and important and productive kind of way of doing things. In terms of the intellectual labor, I'm saying, of just reflecting on the world and trying to be maybe more reflective and maybe more, I don't know, at peace with your own thinking. Right. But at the end of the day, just to circle back to the original question, you cannot force it on another person's perceptive norms and happiness. Because it's very, very hard to, in terms of the happiness component, to provide any external justification for that.
Oh, thank you. I think that's the end of our episode.
Thanks. That was fun.
And I would like to express my gratitude for accepting the invitation 2 times. And
thanks.
And I'm sorry for the first time.
No worries.
Yeah, I didn't figure out what happened to the camera.
Yeah, no worries. They are very devious.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I hope we'll see each other again, maybe in another country, or again in Mongolia,
sure.
Or maybe in Poland.
Yeah, you're very much invited. So, and all of the team. So,
thank you so much. Okay. Now I'm gonna stop the recording now.